Somewhere in an ancient farming settlement, after weeks of relentless work through a difficult harvest, a person simply stopped. Not from injury, not from illness anyone could see. Their hands kept moving out of habit, but something behind their eyes had gone flat. Food didn't interest them, sleep didn't restore them. Tasks that once felt manageable now felt impossible, and no single day of rest seemed to fix it. We'd recognize that state immediately today. We even have a word for it. But burnout, it turns out, isn't a byproduct of email and open-plan offices. It's a predictable outcome of sustained, unrelenting demand on a human nervous system that was never designed to run at full output indefinitely. And ancient humans, working brutally hard physical lives with none of the recovery tools we take for granted, absolutely hit it. So how did they recognize it, and what did they do when the work itself couldn't simply stop? Start with why burnout exists at all. Because it isn't a design flaw. It's a warning light. Modern research into chronic stress physiology has found that the human body's stress response system, built for short, intense bursts of exertion followed by genuine recovery, begins to break down under prolonged, unrelenting demand with insufficient rest. Cortisol regulation shifts, sleep quality degrades, motivation and emotional resilience collapse, not because the person is weak, but because the underlying biological system was never built to sustain that load indefinitely without cost. This system evolved in an environment of intense but intermittent effort, a dangerous hunt, a hard seasonal push, followed by real recovery once the immediate demand passed. The problem burnout represents isn't effort itself. It's effort without recovery, stretched out for too long, and that specific combination was entirely possible in the ancient world, especially once humans shifted from hunting and gathering into agriculture, a transition that dramatically increased how relentless and unforgiving physical labor could become. The archaeological and skeletal record from early agricultural societies tells a genuinely striking story on this point. Studies comparing the skeletal remains of hunter-gatherer populations to early farming populations consistently show that the shift to agriculture correlated with worse physical health markers in many respects. Not better. Increased signs of chronic physical stress, more repetitive strain-related skeletal damage, and evidence of sustained, grinding physical labor far beyond what hunter-gatherer lifestyles typically demanded. Agriculture produced more total food, but it also produced a kind of relentless, seasonal labor intensity that hunting and gathering societies, with their comparatively irregular and varied work patterns, largely didn't experience in the same way. This matters because agricultural labor introduced something closer to the modern experience of burnout. Long, sustained stretches of demanding, repetitive work, tied to unforgiving harvest deadlines that couldn't simply be paused or delegated away, with recovery time squeezed by the basic mathematics of feeding a growing settlement through an entire year on what could be grown and stored in a few critical weeks. Ancient societies didn't have the word burnout, but their medical and religious texts describe something functionally very close to it, using the vocabulary available to them at the time. Several ancient medical traditions describe conditions characterized by persistent exhaustion unrelieved by rest, loss of motivation, and a kind of joyless depletion distinct from ordinary tiredness or illness, conditions physicians attributed to overwork, excessive strain, or an imbalance brought on by sustained exertion without adequate recovery, depending on the specific medical framework of the culture describing it. Ancient Chinese medical texts describe patterns of depleted vital energy specifically associated with prolonged overexertion, treated through mandated rest, dietary adjustment, and reduced workload, a formal acknowledgement that a person could be worked into a state that ordinary short-term rest alone couldn't fully repair. Ancient Greek and Roman writers similarly described states of profound exhaustion among soldiers, laborers, and administrators under sustained demanding conditions, occasionally recommending extended withdrawal from duty as the only effective remedy, a treatment essentially unavailable to most ordinary agricultural workers, but clearly understood, at least conceptually, by the physicians and philosophers writing about it. Where ancient societies differed most significantly from much of modern life wasn't necessarily in avoiding burnout altogether, but in how communally the recovery process was often handled once it set in. Many traditional agricultural societies, studied by anthropologists as a partial window into ancient labor patterns, built structured seasonal rhythms directly into community life, intense, demanding labor concentrated around planting and harvest, followed by genuinely slower, lower-demand periods built into the community's shared calendar, rather than left to individual negotiation or willpower. Religious festivals, seasonal ceremonies, and mandated communal rest days appear independently across numerous ancient agricultural cultures, often timed specifically around the most demanding points in the agricultural calendar. This wasn't simply spiritual observance layered on top of practical life. In many documented cases, it functioned as enforced collective recovery, a socially sanctioned reason for an entire community to stop working simultaneously. Precisely because expecting exhausted individuals to independently negotiate their own rest against relentless collective labor demands rarely worked reliably, then or now. Ancient hierarchies and divisions of labor also functioned, whether intentionally or not, as a partial buffer against the kind of individual, isolated burnout increasingly common in modern work. In many small-scale traditional societies, demanding tasks were distributed and rotated across a group rather than concentrated indefinitely on a single individual, and social expectations generally discouraged any one person from being pushed to sustained extremes while others in the community rested, a norm enforced as much by shared communal visibility as by any formal rule, since in a small group, everyone could see exactly how much everyone else was working. This stands in meaningful contrast to certain modern work structures, where an individual's overwork can remain largely invisible to the people around them, occurring behind closed doors, screens, and organizational boundaries that ancient communal life simply didn't have. Burnout in a small, tightly interdependent ancient community was considerably harder to hide, and precisely because it was harder to hide, it may often have been intervened upon sooner. None of this means ancient life was somehow gentler or less demanding than modern work. By nearly every measurable standard, ancient physical labor was harder, more dangerous, and less optional than most modern jobs. But ancient societies appear to have built something modern work culture has, in many cases, quietly lost: structural, non-negotiable recovery periods built into the fabric of communal life itself, rather than left entirely to individual willpower, personal boundary setting, or an employer's discretion. When rest was mandated by shared ritual and enforced by collective visibility, it happened. When it depended entirely on an exhausted individual successfully advocating for their own recovery against relentless demand, it far more often didn't. A dynamic ancient communities seem to have understood instinctively, even without the language of burnout, to describe exactly what they were preventing. Trace the whole arc back, and the story of ancient burnout isn't really about a uniquely modern failure to cope. It's about a biological limit that has always existed, first pushed hard by the relentless demands of early agriculture, and managed, imperfectly but structurally, through communal rhythms, mandated collective rest, and shared labor that modern work culture has in many places replaced with something more isolating and far less enforced. The exhaustion that leaves you flat, unmotivated, and unrestored by a single weekend isn't a personal failing invented by modern life. It's an ancient biological warning light, first switched on by the earliest exhausting harvests humans ever brought in. And the societies that survived it best weren't the ones who simply told individuals to push through. They were the ones who built rest into the structure itself.